Hello. This exercise will cover the creation of endpoints, the primary method used in Maestro to create the finite element mesh. We will be using this model shown here for our exercise. As you are aware, in Maestro, the models have substructures and modules shown here. The particular module we're going to be using is Module 2 of Substructure 3. I'm going to select it using this button here. This is now the view part and the current part, as shown here by this symbol. Endpoints, which I will turn on using this button, are the primary method of creating the mesh. View an endpoint as a rail. The endpoint menu here turns on viewing the endpoints. I'm going to select the keel endpoint, which is now highlighted. Endpoints have a reference end and an opposite end. The reference end is at the beginning of the module. The opposite end is at the far extent of the module. This module has 6 sections with a frame spacing of 80 inches, hence 480 inches for this module, for this endpoint, Endpoints are identified by their endpoint number and then their section number. This is endpoint 1, section 0, section 1, section 2, and so forth. I'm going to select a deck edge endpoint here. As you can see, it is located at a Y location, or vertical location, of 360 inches above the module's 0 reference point, which in this case is the keel. The Z, or transverse location, for this endpoint is at 256 inches off center line on the reference end and goes out to 292.19 some odd inches at the opposite end. Unlike many other finite element codes, endpoints, or the mesh in Maestro, is dynamic. And by that I mean that when you move either end of an endpoint, all of the intermediate endpoints will move. For instance, I'm going to move the opposite end of this module to 400 inches, as shown here. Just enter 400, I modify it. The structure has now moved with it. And by this you can see how the strake, this blue structure, has all moved with it. It's easy to move back. I move it back to its correct point, enter 360, modify it, and it's back. At this point, I am now going to shift to another model where we have just a few endpoints created and walk you through how to create endpoints. I will now start to create endpoints. First, I go to the endpoint menu. I will also turn on endpoints up here, turning on the nodes. I'll create endpoint number 1 by pushing the ID button. And in this particular module, I had already defined the substructure and module coordinates, and that it was 6 sections of 80 inches apiece, so the reference end and opposite end numbers are already created. This particular endpoint is going to be on the keel, so the Y and Z endpoints will be 0. I hit create. Now I'll create an endpoint on the inner bottom just above that. Click on ID number. It automatically increments the number, ID number, to the next. I will then create or modify the Y location to 75 inches at the reference end and at the opposite end. Push create, and it's there. I'm going to fit, so now I can see it. And I'm also going to dial, using the central mouse wheel, zoom out a bit so I can see everything. I'm going to pan this over a bit. Now I'll continue. I'll increment ID number 3. I'm going to put this particular endpoint out at the extent of the inner bottom, except I made a mistake. This endpoint should not be at 75 inches, it should be at 48 inches. So I'm going to correct that. I'm going to modify it to 48 and 48, modify. Now I'll increment to number 3. This endpoint will also be in there in the bottom, but it's going to be out at the hull. So the Z, the transverse direction, is going to be 174 inches at the reference end, 229 inches at the opposite end. I hit create, and there it is. I'll now add endpoints that are similar to endpoint number 2. I select number 2, increment, and it takes all those values. So the 48 is there, the 48 is there. I increment the number. You notice the Y direction, the Y number is the same. Now I'll put in a new Z location, which is 75 inches at each end. Hit create. Repeat. Endpoint number 5, that's going to be at 150 inches. 150, 150, create. Now I'm going to go to these endpoints. I'm going to pick endpoint number 4. I'm going to increment it, but now I'm going to create the endpoint on the shell below the inner bottom, which is 75 inches off center line, but the height in this particular case is 10 inches at the reference end and 8 inches at the bottom end. You can see how you can just modify those numbers, create it, and there it is. I'll now go to endpoint number, this endpoint, which is 150 inches off center line, increment that. I'm now going to use that 150 off center line, and the new endpoint is at 32 inches at the reference end, 20 inches at the opposite end. Create. I'm going to close this and spin it around. As you can see, the endpoints have been created. You can continue this all the way down throughout the structure. Now I'm going to open a model that already has all of the endpoints created. Here I go. When you next see the screen, that model will be up with all the endpoints done. Here is now the model with all of the endpoints created. I'm going to spin it around so you can see all of the points. You can see the shell as I put it into body plan. You can see all of the endpoints. Here's the center line, here's the shell, and as the shell changes, obviously going toward the length of the ship, because this ship does not have parallel mid-body. As you can see, creating endpoints is not difficult. They're all there. The mesh is done for this particular module. The next video will cover creation of